She had looked at herself in the mirror at the coaching inn that morning and made a decision she could not entirely explain, even to herself. She looked like a woman who had lost everything. That was fine. That was in fact exactly what she needed to look like. Imelda Voss, or rather, the woman who had been born Imelda Voss, who had grown up at Ashcroft Park, who had learned to ride on the grounds of that estate and had pressed wildflowers in the library on the 3rd floor, pinned her hair flat against her head, smoothed the gray wool of her borrowed dress, and told the woman in the mirror that this would work. It had to work. She had approximately 10 days before the solicitors finalized everything, and 10 days was long enough if she was careful. She had not been careful once. She did not intend to make the same mistake twice. The coaching inn was 4 miles from Ashcroft Park. She walked the distance rather than take a cart, because walking gave her time to remember what she was supposed to have forgotten. The way the lane curved at the elm grove, the sound the gravel made on the East Drive, that particular crunch that she had always found irritating as a child and now thought of with something close to grief, the exact height of the iron gate, which had never been fixed after the storm of 1809, and which listed slightly to the left. She arrived at the gate at 9:30. A man she did not recognize was raking leaves on the far side of the lawn. That was the first change she had to absorb. She gave her name at the servants' entrance as Imelda Marsh. Marsh had been her mother's maiden name. It felt both like a disguise and like a small act of tribute, and she was not yet certain which feeling was stronger. The housekeeper who opened the door was a thin woman with a careful face and close-set eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Dunmore. "You're the applicant for the companion position," Mrs. Dunmore said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You've references?" Imelda produced the letter she had spent 3 evenings composing in a hand that was not her own, from a household in Edinburgh that did not exist. She watched Mrs. Dunmore read it. She watched the housekeeper's eyes move from line to line. She kept her breathing even. "You'll do," Mrs. Dunmore said finally. "The dowager is particular, but she's not difficult if you're quiet and don't make a fuss. Your room is on the 3rd floor, East Corridor. Dinner for the servants is at 6. You'll start this morning." She folded the letter and handed it back. "Leave your things and come down. His Grace arrived last night, and he's already asked for the study to be opened, which means the whole East Wing needs attention, and we are short-handed." Imelda said, "Of course," in the voice she had been practicing, even plain, neither too eager nor too dull, and she followed Mrs. Dunmore up the back stairs, the East Corridor. She had not expected that. Her old bedroom had been in the East Corridor. It was on the 3rd floor, 2nd door from the landing, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden, and, beyond it, the copper beech that her father had planted the year she was born. She had sat in that window more times than she could count. She had done her lessons there. She had hidden there, once, when she was 9, and had broken a vase and could not face the consequence. The room she was given was not her old room. It was smaller, at the end of the corridor, with a narrow bed and a washstand, and a window that looked out over the stable yard. But she could see, from the doorway, the door to her old room. It was closed. She wondered what was in it now. She did not let herself stand there long. She had told herself, on the walk from the inn, that she would be methodical. She was not here to feel things. She was here to find the document her solicitor believed was still in the house, a codicil to her father's will, signed and witnessed, which would invalidate the transfer of the estate to her uncle's creditors and restore the entailment to the female line. Her solicitor, Mr. Beecham, believed the document existed. Her father's former secretary believed it had been placed in the estate's strongbox before her father died. The strongbox was in the study. The study was in the East Wing. She had 10 days. She was partway down the back stairs, when Mrs. Dunmore appeared at the bottom and said, "Marsh, His Grace's boots." Imelda stopped. Mrs. Dunmore held out a pair of riding boots. They were caked with mud, not lightly, not as if someone had walked through a puddle, but thoroughly, as if the wearer had ridden hard through a field and then left them for someone else to deal with, which was, of course, exactly what had happened. "They need doing before 10, Mrs. Dunmore said. "The boot room is off the kitchen. There's a kit on the shelf." Imelda took the boots. She looked at them for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am," and carried them to the boot room and found the kit on the shelf and sat down on the low stool and began to clean the Duke of Ashcroft's boots. She thought, as she worked, that her mother would have found this funny. Her mother had possessed a particular dry sense of humor that had always surfaced at the most unexpected moments. At funerals, at formal dinners, in the middle of arguments that were going very badly. She could almost hear her mother's voice. "Well, Imelda, you have come a long way." She had. Or rather, she had come back a very short distance to a place she should never have left, and she was cleaning the boots of the man who was, at this particular moment, occupying her family's home on the basis of a legal arrangement she intended to overturn. She worked the mud off in long, even strokes. She was thorough. She was, she decided, going to be excellent at this job. She was going to be so quiet and so efficient and so utterly unremarkable that no one in this house would think of her at all, and in 10 days she would find what she needed and she would walk out of the front door. The front door, not the servant's entrance, and she would never clean another man's boots for the rest of her life. She returned the boots to Mrs. Dunmore at 5 minutes to 10. She did not meet the Duke that day, nor the next. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly, because she had always been a quick learner and because she already knew this house, knew where the floorboards creaked, knew which door stuck in the damp, knew that the bell in the east corridor rang flat and always had. She absorbed the new geography of it. Which rooms had been changed, which had been left alone, where the staff gathered in the evenings. The dowager, who Imelda had been hired to companion, was the Duke's grandmother. She was 81 years old and sharp in the way that very old women who have survived a great deal are, sharp, not with the sharpness of cruelty, but with the sharpness of someone who has simply stopped pretending not to see things clearly. She had white hair and excellent posture, and she looked at Imelda on their first meeting the way a person looks at a word they cannot quite place. "Marsh," she said. "Where are you from, child?" "Surrey, Your Grace," Imelda said. This was true. Ashcroft Park was in Surrey. The dowager looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "Read to me." "Third shelf, the blue binding." Imelda read. She read well, she had always read well, and the dowager listened with her eyes half closed and her hands folded in her lap, and after an hour she said, "That will do for today," and Imelda thanked her and left. On the third day she met the Duke. She had not meant to. She had been crossing the entrance hall with a shawl the dowager had forgotten in the morning room. And he had come in through the front door at exactly the wrong moment, and they had nearly collided at the foot of the stairs. He was younger than she had expected. She had formed some picture of him in her mind. Older, heavier, someone who moved through the world, with the particular carelessness of a man who had never once considered that anything might not belong to him. But he was perhaps 30, with a lean face and dark eyes, and an expression that was, at this particular moment, one of mild surprise. "I beg your pardon," he said. He had good manners. She had not expected that either. "The fault is mine, Your Grace," she said. She kept her eyes down, the way she had observed the other women in the household keeping their eyes down. "Are you?" He paused. "You're new." "Yes, Your Grace. I'm the companion to the dowager. Marsh, Marsh," he repeated. She had the sense he was filing the name somewhere. "You're well settled in?" "Very well, thank you, Your Grace." He nodded once, the brisk nod of a man who considers a social obligation discharged, and continued up the stairs. Imelda carried the shawl to the dowager and did not think about the encounter again. Or rather, she told herself not to think about it, which was a different thing entirely, and she was honest enough to know it. The thing she had not prepared for was how much it hurt to be in this house. She had thought she had prepared. She had spent 2 months after Mr. Beecham had first suggested the plan, convincing herself that she had made her peace with it, that she could walk these rooms with the detachment of a stranger. But there was the morning room where her mother had always taken her tea. There was the long passage to the library, which smelled exactly the same as it always had. Old paper and lemon oil and something faintly sweet that she had never been able to identify. There was the kitchen garden, which she could see from the narrow window of her room on the 3rd floor, and the copper beech at the edge of it, which was exactly the same as she had left it, which was, of course, the same as it had always been. Trees did not grieve. She did. She had thought she had finished grieving. She had been wrong about that too. She had been in the house for 5 days when she overheard the conversation in the corridor outside the study. She had not been eavesdropping. She had been on her way to ask Mrs. Dunmore about the dowager's afternoon schedule, and she had paused, purely by chance, purely because her boot heel had caught on the edge of the carpet runner, and she had heard the Duke's voice through the half-open door. He was speaking with someone she did not recognize. A man's voice, lower than the Duke's, saying, "There's still the matter of the codicil, Your Grace. Voss's solicitor is apparently making inquiries." Imelda went very still. "I'm aware," the Duke said. His voice was even. It did not sound like the voice of a man who was worried. It also did not sound like the voice of a man who was hiding anything. "If the document exists, then we deal with it accordingly," the Duke said. "I am not interested in holding property I'm not entitled to hold." A pause. "Your Grace?" "You heard me, Alderton." There was a quality in his voice she could not immediately name. Not irritation. Something quieter. "If the entailment holds, then the estate is not mine to administer. I was appointed trustee pending resolution of the inheritance, not given a deed of title. There is a difference." Another pause. "Find out what Voss's solicitor knows, and find out if there's a codicil. If there is, I want it found." Imelda stepped back from the door. She stood in the corridor for a long moment, with her hand pressed flat against the wallpaper. The same wallpaper, yellow stripes on cream, that had been there since she was a child, and she thought about what she had just heard. He had not known. Or rather, she corrected herself, because it was important to be precise. He had known about the legal situation in the abstract, but he had not known the full extent of it. He was the trustee of the estate, not the owner. He was here on behalf of the creditors, on behalf of the legal proceedings, not because he had simply decided to move into a house that was not his. She thought of Mrs. Dunmore saying, "His Grace arrived last night, and he's already asked for the study to be opened." She had assumed the worst. She had been so certain she knew the shape of this story. The powerful man, the appropriated house, the injustice that required correcting, that she had not considered the possibility that the powerful man might not know about the injustice either. She went and spoke to Mrs. Dunmore about the dowager's schedule. She was very composed. She thought she did it rather well. That evening she sat at the narrow desk in her room and wrote a letter to Mr. Beecham and then did not send it, because she did not know what she wanted to say. She wanted to say, "I think I have been wrong about certain things." She wanted to say, "There is a document in this house, and the Duke says he wants it found." She wanted to say, "I am not sure this story is the one I thought I was in." She sealed the letter anyway. She would decide about sending it in the morning. She did not sleep well. Lady Thornwick arrived on the 6th day. She arrived in a carriage with a crest on the door, and a quantity of luggage that required 3 footmen to unload and she swept into the entrance hall with the particular air of a woman who has been told she is beautiful so many times that she has entirely stopped questioning it and started simply moving through the world as if it were arranged for her benefit. Her name was Lady Clarissa Thornwick. She was, apparently, a prospective match. The dowager had mentioned, obliquely, that the Duke's family had been hoping he would marry before the end of the year, and that there was a lady coming to stay, and that the lady was well connected and had lovely manners. The dowager said this last part in a tone that suggested lovely manners were not precisely what she found most compelling in a person. Imelda said nothing. Lady Thornwick was civil to the dowager. She was charming to the Duke, or at least to the Duke's profile, which was the part of him that Imelda observed from her position slightly behind, and to the left of the dowager's chair during the formal dinner of the 6th evening. She was not, however, civil to the staff. Imelda had seen this before. She had seen it, in fact, from the other side, had been the one sitting at the table while someone else stood in the periphery and hoped not to attract attention. She had not, she realized, always been as careful as she should have been in those years when she had not known what it was to stand on the other side. That thought sat uncomfortably. She let it. Lady Thornwick, on the morning of the 7th day, spilled an entire pot of chocolate on the morning-room carpet, not by accident, or rather, not entirely by accident, but because she had set the pot down carelessly and then pushed it with her sleeve while gesturing to make a point, and then looked at the housemaid who had brought it and said, in a voice of exquisite boredom, "Well, I suppose you'll see to that." The housemaid, a girl of perhaps 16 who had done nothing wrong, said yes and began to kneel, and Imelda, who was standing at the window with the dowager's embroidery hoop, set down the hoop and said quietly, "I'll send for more cloths. The housemaid can't lift the carpet alone." Lady Thornwick looked at her. It was the look that certain people reserve for those they consider beneath their notice, not hostile, exactly, but dismissive in the way that was somehow worse than hostility. "You're the companion," she said. "Yes, my lady, do see to it then." She returned to her letter. Imelda helped the housemaid lift the corner of the carpet. The girl, whose name was Polly, murmured, "Thank you," so quietly that it was almost not a sound at all. Imelda nodded once, the way her mother had always nodded at things that needed acknowledging, without being made a great fuss of, and between them they got the chocolate up. She did not encounter the Duke again until the afternoon of the 7th day, when she had been sent to the library to locate a specific volume of correspondence that the dowager wished to consult, and she had found the library already occupied. He was at the desk. He was reading. He looked up when she came in and he said, "Miss Marsh," and she said, "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," and she went to the 3rd shelf. She knew exactly which shelf. She had spent a considerable portion of her adolescence in this room, and she found the volume, and she was turning to leave when he said, "You grew up reading, didn't you?" She stopped. "Your Grace." "You went directly to the 3rd shelf," he said. "You didn't look at the spines. You knew where you were going." He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Most people, even if they've been told the location of a volume, glance along the spines. You didn't. Imelda held the volume. She considered her options. "I have an excellent memory for libraries," she said finally. "Evidently." He looked at her for a moment. "Have you been to this library before? Or one very like it?" "I've served in houses with extensive libraries," she said. "One learns the layout." It was not, precisely, a lie. She had learned the layout. She had learned it as a child, on her hands and knees behind the 2nd shelf, reading the spines from below because they were too high to reach. He seemed to accept this. He nodded and returned to his reading, and she left, and she stood in the corridor, with the book pressed against her sternum and told herself that 10 days had seemed like such a long time when she had started, and now she was on day 7, and she had not yet found the codicil, and she was running out of time. She found it on the 8th day. She had spent the morning with the dowager, reading the correspondence aloud, and in the afternoon she was given 2 hours of liberty because the dowager was sleeping. She had planned for this. She went to the study on the pretext of retrieving a newspaper that Mrs. Dunmore had mentioned was on the desk, and she found the room empty. And she went to the strongbox. The strongbox was where it had always been, built into the wall behind the portrait of her great-grandfather, which was painted in the style of someone who had wanted very much to look like a military man, and had succeeded only in looking like a man who had borrowed a military man's coat. She had been told once that the portrait had always made her father laugh, and that the hiding of the strongbox behind it had been a private joke of his. She had found this fact unbearably dear. She found it so still. The lock was the same. She had not expected that. She had expected the lock to have been changed, and she had brought a set of picks that Mr. Beecham's clerk, an extremely resourceful young man who asked no questions, had provided. But the lock was the same, and she knew the combination, and in 45 seconds she had the box open. The codicil was in a leather folio, exactly where her father's secretary had said it would be. She stood there for a moment with the folio in her hands. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind in the elms, and somewhere in the house a door opened and closed, and the clock on the mantel ticked. Her father had been dead for 3 years. She had been 22 when he died, and she had not handled the grief particularly well. And then, before she had finished handling it, her uncle had appeared with his debts and his creditors, and his assurances that it would all be sorted, and it had not been sorted at all. And by the time she understood what was happening, the estate had been put in trust, and she had been in lodgings in Bath, with 2 trunks and £60, and a letter from Mr. Beecham, saying he believed there was still a remedy if she was willing to pursue it. She had been willing. She was still willing. She replaced the folio in the strongbox. It was safer there than with her, until she could contact Mr. Beecham, and she had just closed the strongbox and was reaching up to slide the portrait back into place when the door opened. She turned. The Duke stood in the doorway. He looked at the portrait, angled out from the wall. He looked at the strongbox. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, which was, she found, quite long enough. "Miss Marsh," he said, in a voice that was very measured, "I think we should perhaps speak plainly to one another." "Yes," she said, "I think we should." She had not planned for this. She had planned for several contingencies: being seen entering the study, being asked to account for her presence, being required to leave before she found what she needed. But she had not quite planned for being caught with the portrait out from the wall and the box visible and no possible explanation that would hold. So she told him the truth. She told him her name. Not Marsh, Voss. Imelda Voss, daughter of the late Sir Charles Voss of Ashcroft Park, whose estate had passed under administration following his death, and the subsequent financial ruin of his brother-in-law, who had been made executor. She told him about Mr. Beecham. She told him about the codicil. She told him about the 10 days, and the coaching inn, and the borrowed gray dress. She watched his face while she talked. It was very controlled, his face. But his eyes were doing something that she thought, if she were reading it correctly, might be something like anger. Not at her, or at least not only at her, at something larger. When she finished, there was a silence. "Your uncle," he said, "told my family's solicitors that no document of this kind existed. He said this twice in writing, under oath." "Yes," she said. "I know. He was lying." "Yes." Another silence. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the drive, and she watched the line of his shoulders and waited. "I came here," he said, "because I was asked by the courts to administer the estate pending resolution of the inheritance. I was told the situation was straightforward." He paused. "I was told the estate had no direct heir. My uncle had reasons to want it to appear that way. Yes." He turned back from the window. "The document you found, the codicil, if it says what you believe it says, then the entailment holds and this estate is yours. Not the creditors, not the trusts, yours. That is what Mr. Beecham believes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you simply come to the house as yourself? Why?" He gestured at the gray wool dress, at the flat-pinned hair. "Why this?" "Because," she said carefully, "I did not know what sort of man was here. I did not know if you were a man who would hand over a document that resolved a situation in someone else's favor, or a man who would lose it." She paused. "I didn't know if you knew about the codicil. I didn't know if you were part of what my uncle had done." He looked at her steadily. "And now I've heard you tell your solicitor that you wanted the codicil found, that you were not interested in holding property you're not entitled to hold." She held his gaze. "I think I was wrong about what sort of man you were. I am trying to decide how to say that without it sounding self-serving." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile, something smaller. "It does sound somewhat self-serving," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I'm aware." He looked away again. "I'll contact my solicitors today. And yours, if you'll give me Mr. Beecham's direction. The codicil should be reviewed by both parties together. If it's valid, and I have no reason to believe it is not, given where it was found and how, then the proceedings can be set in motion before the end of the week." She said, "Your Grace, and then stopped because she did not know quite what she had meant to say. Thank you seemed insufficient. She was thanking a man for simply not being dishonest, and that should not be the bar at which one was moved to gratitude, and yet here she was, moved to gratitude. He seemed to understand. "This is your home," he said. "You should be in it." She thought of the window on the 3rd floor, east corridor, the kitchen garden, the copper beech, the wallpaper with the yellow stripes, the portrait of her great-grandfather that had always made her father laugh. "Yes," she said, "I should." Mr. Beecham arrived 2 days later. The codicil was reviewed by 3 solicitors, hers, the Duke's, and a third appointed by the court, and it was found to be exactly what she had believed it to be, a valid, witnessed document establishing the entailment in the female line and superseding the transfer of administration to her uncle's creditors. Her uncle was sent for. That meeting was not pleasant, but it was brief, and at the end of it her uncle left the house and did not come back, and Imelda did not watch him go, because she had already decided there was nothing in his departure she needed to see. She had other things to look at. She walked through the house that evening, not as a companion, not in borrowed gray wool, but in her own dress, the blue wool with the cream collar that she had kept in the bottom of her trunk at the coaching inn, because it was the last dress her mother had ordered made for her, and she had not been able to leave it behind. She walked through the morning room and the library, and the long passage that smelled of paper and lemon oil and the something sweet she had never been able to name. She walked to the window on the 3rd floor, east corridor, and she looked out at the kitchen garden and the copper beech. She stood there for a while. She did not try to rush what she felt. There was no reason to rush it. She did not see the Duke until the following morning, when she encountered him on the East Drive. He was on horseback, returned from an early ride, and she was walking in the garden with her coat buttoned against the October air. He dismounted when he saw her, which was a small formality she had not expected. "Miss Voss," he said. It was the first time he had called her that. She found it strange and correct all at once. "Your Grace." He held the reins loosely and looked out over the drive, and she stood beside him and looked at the same thing, the line of elms, The iron gate with its perpetual leftward lean, the pale morning light on the stone of the house. "I'll be leaving at the end of the week," he said. "I have a house in Northumberland that requires attention, and my purpose here is resolved. Yes." She paused. "Thank you for how you handled all of it. You didn't have to." She stopped. "You could have made it considerably more difficult." "I could have," he agreed. "I prefer not to." She thought about the boots. She thought about the mud and the boot room and the low stool and the kid on the shelf and her mother's voice saying, "Well, Imelda, you have come a long way." She thought about how she had carried those boots back to Mrs. Dunmore and said, "Yes, ma'am," and felt the particular flatness of a humiliation that you are not quite allowed to show on your face. She was looking at the elms. Beside her, she was aware of him looking at her. "You're laughing," he said. "I'm not laughing. You look like you're thinking of something that might make you laugh." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was thinking about the boots." There was a short pause. Then he said, in a careful voice, "I beg your pardon." "The boots," she said. "On my first morning, Mrs. Dunmore gave them to me to clean." She glanced at him. They were very muddy. He was silent for slightly longer than strictly necessary. "Those were my boots." "Yes, I didn't know." "No," she said. "You didn't." Another silence. Then, to his considerable credit, he said, "I'm sorry." "That must have been memorable," she said. She was not laughing. But she was not entirely not laughing either, and he seemed to understand the distinction because the set of his face shifted slightly. Something relaxing in it, something becoming less careful, and he said, "I suppose there is a certain." "There is," she agreed. They stood there in the morning quiet, the two of them, looking at her father's elms and the October light on her father's house and the iron gate that had never been fixed. And she thought that she would fix it now. She would have the gate repaired and the east corridor repainted and the window on the third floor properly caulked against the winter damp. And she would put fresh water in the vases in the morning room. And she would read to the dowager, not as a companion now, but as a neighbor, a friend, a woman who knew this house and belonged in it. He left at the end of the week, as he had said. He came back at Christmas, which she had not expected, and she told him so on the evening of his arrival, in the same library where she had gone directly to the third shelf without looking at the spines, and he had noticed. "I had reasons," he said. "Did you?" "Several," he said. "I can enumerate them if that would be helpful." She thought about it. She was sitting on the settle by the window, with a book she had not been reading for some time, and the fire was very warm, and it was snowing outside the window, and she thought, here, this, the house and the fire and the snow, and this man standing in the library with his hat in his hand and his several reasons. "No," she said. "I think I understand them well enough." He sat down. She did not move to the other end of the settle. The snow came down outside. The fire spoke to itself in the way fires do, and somewhere in the house, in the east corridor, a door she had left open, let in a small cold draught from the window she had not yet had properly caulked, and she made a note to see to it in the morning, and she was, without quite deciding to be, at home.